all the topics that we'll make a list of all the topics that we haven't, covered, or the topics that are left in the syllabus, right? And then tomorrow or day after tomorrow, we'll do those topics, right? But these are very smaller topics, like liquidity trap, and then there's Phillips curve and so on, right? So, but the main target over here is to get started because we have very few days left for your exam. So we should get started and do some past papers practice. So today we'll be doing May, June 17, and in that we will be focusing on both essay questions and the case study questions because both are equally important. So today we are doing May, June 2017 4-2, right? So the variant for Pakistan is 4-2, right? So we'll try to do most of the exam from 4-2 variant, but we can obviously do other variants as well because the syllabus is often quite similar, right? So that's the plan. Okay, now let's get started here. Okay, now let me show you the exam and we can start off with any of the two which you want me to, case study or essay question, right? So there is this very interesting case study in this exam which is about monetary policy and economic growth. So do you want to do the case study today or the essay question? Which of the two do you want to start off with first? Yeah. So case study. Okay, perfect. Let's get started. Okay, so let's read the case study together and then we'll do the question and try to complete it in today's class. Okay, now monetary policy and economic growth. Okay, now monetary policy and economic growth. Between 2009 and 2014, the Central Bank of United Kingdom used policy measures of quantitative easing. Now, this might be a new word for you, and very low interest rates. Okay, now what is quantitative easing? Let me tell you, we have studied this already in the syllabus, but we used a different name for that. So quantitative easing is, if you remember, we talked about open market operations. So we said how the central bank affects the, money supply, and due to that, interest rates are affected, open market operations, right? So let me give you a quick recap. So in open market operations, what basically happens that central bank buys back government bonds. Central bank buys back government bonds. Do you remember we talked about that? So there are two sides to it. Open market operations has two sides. First side is, one side is that you sell government bonds and people buy those government bonds, and then that reduces the money supply in the market. The second part is that the central bank purchases back government bonds, right? And when it does that, what happens? People get their money back, right? So what's the entire process? Do you remember that? I said all of this is happening through. So let me show you through a graph that I made before as well. Okay, so commercial bank is the intermediary, and then you have households, like people like you and me who are, buying government bonds, and on the other side of the equation, you have government, right? Okay, now think about this. The way it happens is there are two sides to open market operation. The first side is that government issues government bond, right? Government issues government bond, but through commercial banks. So bonds are issued, right? And people get the bonds, right? And in return, what happens? People, households pay money which goes to the government. Yes or no, right? So cash or money is going from households to government. Are you getting me? Is this simple? So when this happens, this is first time when you are issuing bonds. When the bonds are issued for the first time, money supply, exactly. Deposits are reduced. Isha, at the moment I'm explaining you when the government first time issues the bond. So first time when the government issues the bond, the money supply reduces because, see, have a look at this. Cash is flowing from households to government. Cash is flowing from household to government, right? So, and bonds are flowing from government to households. This is making sense, right? So this was when central bank issues government bonds, right? So this is when central bank issues government bonds. So this is the first side, right? Later on, when opposite thing happens, that now the central bank is buying back the bonds and giving people back their money, right? Government buys bond, exactly, right? Yeah. When government buys bond, exactly, that's correct, and that's correct, absolutely. And when reverse happens, in that case, what happens? Now, this was when the government was issuing bonds, right? So from government, the bonds are flowing to the households, and in return, households are paying cash to the government. This is how it happens, right? And obviously, deposits decrease when deposits of commercial bank decrease because the money has been channelized from households to the government. So commercial banks have less deposits, and when they have less deposits, they cannot issue so much loans, right? When the second type of transactions take place, in which what happens basically, that now it will be the government buying back the bonds, right? So bonds are coming back to the government from households via commercial banks, because we know commercial banks are the intermediary who facilitate this entire transactions, right? So commercial banks will always be in the middle, but now people are getting back their money, right? People, households are getting back their money, which means that deposits in commercial banks increase. And when that happens, commercial banks now have ability to issue more loans, right? And when there's more money supply and there are more loans, what happens to interest rates? Isha, when there will be more money supply and more loans being created, what will happen to interest rates? When there's more supply of loans, what happens to interest rates? Interest rates should decrease. Interest rates are low. Excellent, excellent. And this is exactly what will happen. So this was the scenario when the government is buying back the bonds, buying back bonds. Perfect. That's correct. That's absolutely correct. Okay. Now this is exactly what is known as quantitative easing. Now this is, as I said, this is a new word, but the concept we already know. This is known as quantitative easing. So quantitative easing is when the central bank is buying back its bonds from the households, and as a result, the interest rates decreases. That is what quantitative easing, and that is what the case study is talking about, right? Now let's go back and let's have a look at this. Okay, between 2009-2014, the central bank of the United Kingdom used policy measures of quantitative easing and very low interest rates, right? So when there's quantitative easing, interest rates decrease. The finance minister said that the monetary policy was the primary tool for encouraging investment that could lead to economic growth. So it's saying that monetary policy, which is basically interest rate, is the primary tool for increasing investment and leading to economic growth. Private businesses, however, said that quantitative easing by itself cannot restore confidence in the economy, right? Private businesses have a different approach. They're saying that quantitative easing is not enough, whereas government is thinking that quantitative easing is a good policy. It needs to be supported by a range of supply side policies. Now, do you remember what supply side policies are? So supply side policies are any initiatives by the government that increase your production potential, right? So any government policies that increase your production potential, like giving subsidies, giving tax holidays to businesses, right, to facilitate them so that they can produce more. Private sector wants government to focus on supply side policies, right? Does it make sense? Right. Okay. So monetary policy, think about this. Monetary policy is all about interest rates and money supply, right? Or to think about this in more simple words, think about this. It's the money supply that affects interest rates, right? It will always be the money supply that will affect your interest rates. If money supply is more, interest rates will be low. If money supply is less, interest rates will be high, right? So the two have inverse relationship. We know this, right? So when there's more money supply, which means there are more loans and so on, obviously interest rates will be low. It's as simple as that. And when it's the opposite, that money supply is less because there are less loans are being issued and so on and so forth, obviously interest rates will be high. Now, how do interest rates, this is the main element in monetary policy. So how do interest rates affect economics, the economic activity of a country? That is what is what we are mainly interested in. So think about this. We did talk about this, that when interest rates are low, what happens? People borrow more. People borrow more. Why? Because they want to buy a new car, they want to buy a new house, they want to invest in their business, and blah, blah, blah. So when interest rates are low, it results in higher consumption, it results in higher investment, and overall, what happens to your aggregate demand? Your aggregate demand increases, right? So this means lower interest rates result in higher economic activity, which means more GDP and more inflation. Is this correct or not? Lower interest rates result in high aggregate demand, economic activity, and we know, we have looked at the graph a couple of times, right? So let me show you this one more time. So when interest rates are low and economic activity is high, your aggregate demand curve will shift to the right. Am I right with this? Right? Your aggregate demand curve will shift to the right. So you have general price level on the y-axis, you have real GDP on the x-axis, and when your aggregate demand will shift to the right, your real GDP will increase and your general price level will also rise. Is this simple? And in opposite case, when interest rates are increasing, people will borrow less, people will invest less, and as the result, your economic activity will decrease and your real GDP will decrease. So that's the idea. So when country wants to increase economic activity, they will want to reduce their interest rates and vice versa. Is this simple now? Is this clear? Okay, so this was your original GDP Y1. This was your original general price level JPL1. When interest rates are low, economic activity increases, and as a result, your aggregate demand curve shifts to the right like this, upwards, and because of that, your real GDP increases and your inflation also increases. Okay, is this simple? Any confusion so far? And vice versa, it will have an opposite effect, right? Okay, now moving back, and are you clear on what supply side policies are? So supply side policies are basically there are three macroeconomic policies: fiscal, monetary policy, fiscal policy, and supply side policies. So supply side policies focus on increasing your country's aggregate supply. What do supply side policies focus on? Supply side policies don't focus on aggregate demand. Fiscal and monetary policy control your aggregate demand, whereas supply side policies are focusing on your aggregate supply. So their main target is to increase the aggregate supply of the country. Their main target is to increase the aggregate supply of the country, right? And how do countries do that? By giving grants to new businesses, like new startups, right, to support them financially to set up, then giving tax holidays, right, to encourage people to invest more. Tax holidays basically means that for the first 4 to 5 years of operations, there will be no taxes imposed on the businesses, and then after that, taxes are imposed and so on, right? So you'll have tax holidays. What else can be done? Subsidies, training to labor force so that there's more productive labor available in the country, right? Human capital development, which includes training, education and healthcare, human development, human capital. We also call this human capital, right? Is this making sense? Like investment in education and healthcare, like investment in education and healthcare. Okay, now let's get back to, this is clear, let's get back to case study and let's read it forward. Okay, great. Okay, now where were we? So the private sector is saying that government should focus on supply side policies. Private businesses, however, said that quantitative easing by itself cannot restore confidence in the economy. It needs to be supported by a range of supply side policies. In particular, policies to help small firms access credit. Credit is basically capital, the money that you need to start a business. Access credit. Pension fund companies also did not welcome the policy and said that it penalized those who rely on the savings for income, right? So think about this. When interest rates are going down, who is getting affected? When interest rates are lower, people who have put their money, who are saving their money and earning interest on that, they will be affected. Yes or no? So that is why pension fund companies are not happy. So companies that hold people pension fund and invest in different places and give them return over time, they are not happy because with lower interest rate, they know that their customers will get less return, and that is not what they like, right? Okay, a policy of quantitative easing was also followed by United States Central Bank, but was criticized by other central banks and governments in the emerging markets, right? They argued that extra money was depressing the value of the US dollar on the exchange markets, right? So in the past, this case study is talking about that in the past, USA, United States also did quantitative easing policy in which they increase the money supply, which reduces the interest rate. But why other countries and other people criticized this policy? Because they said that the extra money was depressing the value of US dollars on exchange markets. Like US exchange rate was getting weaker. This may have increased US competitiveness, but it did not help economic development in the rest of the world as their products became relatively more expensive, right? So what's this is saying, that when the supply of US dollar increases, we know, right? When supply of any currency increases, what happens to its exchange rate? Its exchange rates become weaker. And when exchange rate becomes weaker, what happens? When exchange rate becomes weaker, right, your products become cheaper. So USA products became cheaper and other countries' products were becoming relatively more expensive. Are you getting me? Are you getting the entire cycle? Have a look at this. So what this paragraph is talking about is actually that US did similar thing. They also did quantitative easing. And what happened as the result? When they implemented QE, quantitative easing, obviously we know that money supply increases, higher money supply, and with higher money supply, interest rates are lower. When interest rates are lower, it also increased the supply of dollars on international markets. So the supply of dollars on international markets increased. Right, that's what I'm explaining, right? So when people have more money supply, think about this. What happens with quantitative easing? Government returns back the money of households. Then they obviously deposit their money in the commercial banks, right? Now, when the people's savings is with the commercial banks, they're more likely to spend on international trade, right? They're more likely to import things and so on, and go for what is that called, vacations, and spend their money on different things and so on. When that happens, basically the supply, you must have studied this in your AS, that the supply will increase. The supply of dollars in the market will increase. The supply of dollars in the markets will increase, right? So think about this. It is dollar per pound or whatever you want to think about this. And you have quantity of dollars on the x-axis, right? When that happens, think about this, down sloping is the demand for dollars, right? And upward sloping is the supply for dollars. When people start importing more things because there's more money lying in their bank accounts, right? So what happens to the supply of dollars? Do you remember? You must have studied this in your AS, right? So the supply of dollars will increase. Sorry, there's just a small problem here, right? So it would be pound per dollar, that how many pounds each dollar buys. So if previously each dollar was buying 1 pound, like $1 was equals to 1 pound. Now when people have more money lying in their bank accounts because government has paid them back, and there has been quantitative easing going on, right? The money is back in the people's commercial bank accounts, and now they have more money to spend, they have more money to import, and so on and so forth. So they will use that money, and they will obviously make more international transactions. And as the result, the supply of dollars increases. When supply of dollar increases, what happens? The dollar becomes weaker. The dollar becomes weaker, which means that now instead of 1 pound, each dollar is, let's say, buying only half a pound. Are you getting me? This is the entire relationship. And why would other countries not like it? Why would other countries not like dollars becoming cheaper? Ideally, they should be happy, because anything that they import from USA would be cheaper. But they're not happy about it because what? Because their products have become relatively more expensive, right? Their products have become relatively more expensive. Have a look at this. So it clearly says, right? They argued that the extra money was depressing the value of US dollars on the exchange markets. This may have increased the US competitiveness. US products are becoming cheaper because their exchange rate is weaker now. But it did not help economic development in rest of the world as their products became relatively more expensive. Is it making sense? This is relatively difficult case study, but you have to, right? You have to read it carefully to see what relationships they are, making. And there would obviously be always case studies when you do not understand one or two lines. In that case, obviously, during the practice, we'll try to understand each and every bit of it. But on an actual exam, if there is one or two lines that you do not understand, then you just need to mark it, and you need to try to work around it, right? Because sometimes the language, sometimes the wording can be confusing, and so on, right? Okay, now moving on. By contrast, sorry about that. Okay, by contrast, right. Uh, Right. So if you can revise it, you will find videos on a YouTube channel. If you can revise it, I would say that would be nice, because that will get you a more clear idea. But you do not need to go in that much detail. But revising would definitely help. Right. Okay. In contrast, it was suggested that the greatest threat to global economic development was the culture of risk aversion among companies. Now, this is very important. In contrast, it was suggested that the greatest threat to economic development was the culture of risk aversion. What is risk aversion? That people don't take risk. But in this case, we're not talking about people, we're talking about companies. This meant that too many were concentrating on managing cost while failing to invest sufficiently. What were companies doing across the globe? So companies were trying to manage costs. They were trying to cut their costs rather than to invest. This aim seemed to be to reduce cost rather than create new revenue, right? When growth, revenue, when right. So instead of companies focusing on investing in new projects and generating more revenue, they were trying to cut their cost. Right? When growth is slow, companies often merge and consolidate. You know what merger is, right? When companies merge, rather than make risky investment. This happened in food and beverages, construction, pharmaceutical, and the media, right? So you're getting me? What is happening in this case? So the problem, according to this, is that companies are not investing in new projects and they are becoming more risk averse, right? They're trying to cut their costs, they're laying off people, they're downsizing, and so on. Okay. Now, moving forward, one way to find new opportunities and encourage growth would be to look to emerging markets. What are emerging markets? Developing countries. Emerging market meaning, this is a very commonly used term. Emerging market means developing countries like Pakistan, India, China, and so on, right? Which are emerging. They account for more than half of the global economy, right? So emerging markets, which means developing countries, are more than half of the global economy. Like the total output produced in the world, more than half, more than 50% of the total output produced in the world is coming from which countries? It's coming from emerging markets, which is basically developing countries. Is this making sense? Is it making sense? However, in 2014, emerging markets were suffering large capital outflows, partly caused by stronger US dollars and partly because of demographic factors. Population structure is vital to a nation's prosperity. A young labor force and a small proportion of retired individuals help the economy to grow, right? But what happened in 2014? Emerging markets were suffering large capital outflows. Money and investment was going out of developing countries to developed countries, right? Which should not have had happened, right? Partially because of stronger US dollars, right? And partly because of demographic factors. Now, it did not clearly explain that why was capital flows going out of developing countries, while capital investment is going out of developing countries. The reason that they have mentioned is that dollar was becoming stronger, right? And because demographic. Now, demographic factors are basically age, gender, population size, and so on, right? Now, this is important. Population structure is vital to a nation's prosperity. Okay. a young labor force, right? So what does young labor force means? That we should have a country which has a large percentage of young people. That is what young labor force is. That is what young workforce is, right? Are you getting me? So Pakistan, in Pakistan case, just to quickly give you an estimate, more than almost 50%, or 50% of Pakistan's population is less than 30 years. So you can imagine how much young population we are, right? So more than 50% of our population is less than 30 years of age, right? So that is what it's talking about, a young workforce and a small proportion of retired people, right? So if there's few people retiring and more people are, there are few people retiring and more people are in the working age, so that is what will help the country to grow. That is exactly what happened in India. That is exactly what happened in China, right? They have young population, too high birth rates, which means more young population, more people in the workforce, more people working and less people retiring. So obviously that helps the country grow, which only happens in developing countries. This young labor force only happens in developing countries, not in developed countries. In developed countries, there is aging population. Now, what does aging population mean? Aging population is when it's the opposite. More people are in the retirement age and less people are in the workforce, because obviously people don't, they are lesser culture of family. There are lesser, they are lesser culture of families, and they are lower birth rates and all that stuff, right? Does it make sense? So this is what happens, right? Okay. So in developed countries, we have aging population, whereas in developing countries, we have young population. Is everything clear so far? Isha, is everything clear? Any confusion? Anything you want to ask me? Okay, perfect, great. So let's keep moving. One country that offers great potential is Nigeria. About 43% of its population is under the age of 15. So just imagine what I was trying to explain. 43%, which means that out of 100 random people that you choose in Nigeria, 43 will be below the age of 50, and only 3% are above the age of 65. Just imagine how much young population it is. Demographically, it looks good. The largest generator of GDP in Nigeria is the oil industry. Figure 1 shows the change in price of crude oil between March and August 2014, and figure 2 shows the change in Nigeria's real GDP per head between 2006 and 2014, right? 2006 and 2014. Okay, now have a look at this. Let's look at this. So what is this showing us? Crude oil price, US dollar per barrel. So what was the price of crude oil per barrel? From March 31st, March 2014 to August 2014, right? Between 1 year. No, more than 1 year, basically. Okay, now think about this. So prices were at the starting point, it were like slightly above 107.5, then it fell. So it's a lot of fluctuation. Then it reached its highest point over here. That was June. That was June 2014. And then, prices started to decline. Okay, great. And what is this showing us in the other graph? The second graph is showing us how the GDP of the country changed, how the GDP, real GDP per head, right? So this means we know what per head GDP means. When we divide the GDP, real GDP with population, that gives you real GDP per head. So Nigeria's real GDP per head, US dollars at constant 2000 prices. So the base year was, are you getting what this means? So constant at 2000 prices means that they are considering base year to be 2000. They're considering base year to be 2000, right? Now, just by looking at the graph, we can tell that 2006, what happened in 2006? Your real, Nigeria's real GDP was, 108.15 dollars per person. Then in next year, 847, it constantly increased. Can you see an upward sloping trend? Right? It's very simple to predict, right? Can you see? It's clearly upward sloping trend, right? Okay, is this clear? Right? So on a case study, you'll try to read it thoroughly, but still, if there is 1 or 2 points that are not clear, you will not want to waste your time more than that. First, you'll come to the questions, try to attempt all the questions that you can. And then in case there is any question that you're unable to understand, or let's say there is any still confusion, then I would recommend you to go back to the case study again, revisit it, reread it, and then see how to solve that other question. Is this clear? Okay, now think about this. Students, what's the question here? Explain what is meant by Explain what is meant by the extra money was depressing the value of US dollars on the exchange markets. Now think about this. So what you were asking me about the exchange rate, this is where you will see that it is important to revise that, because this question is directly about exchange rate, right? Explain what is meant by extra money was depressing the value of US dollars on the exchange rate. So let's say, let's quickly revise this, because you said that you are already having problem remembering what we did in the exchange rate. Okay, now what is exchange rate? Let me give you a quick recap. So exchange rate is the value of one currency. Sorry, exchange rate is the value of one currency in terms of another, right? So we know any two currencies would have an exchange rate, right? So if I randomly choose Pakistani rupees and Bangladeshi taka, so there would be an exchange rate between that. What you have to do, just go and Google that what is the value between Pakistani rupees and Bangladeshi currency. The Google will tell you. Similarly, if you are interested in knowing Pakistan's value against dollars, pounds, euros, any other currency, it will do that. Okay. Now, but now, since we're talking about dollars, so we'll look at dollars, right? So think about this. So you have to, what will be on the y-axis? Now listen to this carefully. So on the y-axis, it is exchange rate. And what is exchange rate? As I just said, it is the value of one currency in terms of another. So if we are looking at if we are looking at the exchange rate of dollars, then that would be measured in terms of any other currency. What other currency? That could be pounds, that could be euros, that could be any other thing, right? So exchange rate, think about this. So instead of this, I could have written anything, right? So since we're looking at dollars, so the second currency would always be dollars, but the first currency could be anything. It could be euro per dollar, like how many euros each dollar buys, or it could be rupees per dollar, or it could be, yuan per dollar. Are you getting me? Isha? So whichever currency you are making the exchange rate for, so that currency would be second, and any other currency would be first. So pound per dollar, it means how many pounds would each dollar, like $1 buy. That is what it is. On the x-axis, you will have quantity of dollars. On the x-axis, you will have, since we're looking at the exchange rate of dollars, as I just said, so you will have quantity of dollars on the x-axis. Is this simple? Now, what do we need to add next on the graph? So the next thing that we need to add to the graph is the normal down sloping demand curve of dollars, right? Because we're looking at the exchange rate. Again, I'm repeating this so that it's absolutely clear. Since we're looking at the exchange rate for dollars, right? So we will make a downward sloping demand for dollars, and we'll make an upward sloping supply for dollars. We'll make an upward sloping supply for dollars. Any confusion so far? Where the supply and demand for dollars intersect, that would be your exchange rate. So for the sake of simplicity, let's assume that initially each dollar was buying £1. Initially each dollar was buying just £1. Is this simple? Is this clear? Okay, now think about this. What are the factors that affect demand for dollars, and what are the factors that affect supply for dollars, right? Is everything clear so far? Shouldn't be difficult. So what are the factors that affect demand for dollars, and what are the factors that affect supply for dollars? Now think about this. Who will demand dollars? Now listen to this very carefully. People who don't have dollars, but they want to make a transaction with USA. I repeat, people who don't have dollars, but who want to make a transaction with USA. Like think about this. Every time a student goes to USA, can he or she make transactions in the local currency? If an international student from some other country is going to USA, can they make a transaction in USA in any other currency apart from dollars? The answer to that should be no, right? Excellent, right? Now, what happens? Think about this. So foreigners, when they're going to USA, they would need dollars, right? And who is supplying dollars to the world? Now think about this. There is only one country, in fact, one institution in the world that has the right to print dollars. Just like there is one institution in the entire world which has the right to print Pakistani rupees. So it is the State Bank of Pakistan that has the right in the entire world to print Pakistani rupees. Similarly, it is the State Bank of USA which has the right to print US dollars. Is this making sense? Right? So who supplies dollar to the entire world? It is only the Americans, or you can say USA Central Bank. Let's put it that Americans are also part of it, because when the central bank, their central bank prints currency, it becomes available to Americans. And when Americans go to other countries. Are you getting me? Now listen to this very carefully. So think about this. Americans, just like other people are going to America to study, for tourism, for vacation, similarly, Americans are going to other countries for different things, for tourism, for things like that. So when they spend their money, that would increase the supply for their currency. So every time an American is going abroad for tourism, let's say to Pakistan, or let's say UK, in this case, we're talking about, let's say, so when Americans go to what is that called? UK for tourism and all that stuff. So the supply for dollars will increase. The supply for dollars will increase. Is it making sense? The supply for dollars will increase. Okay, is this making sense? Okay, now how would the demand for dollars increase? Every time there are other people who are going to, let's say, other countries, people who are going to America for, let's say, study, for tourism, for investment, what happens? They convert their currency into American dollars, and that increases the demand for dollars and so on. Right? That increases the demand for dollars and so on. Is it simple? Right? So this is what you need to think about. Right? Okay. Now, great. So the idea is fairly simple, that whatever the change in the exchange rate is. Now the question is talking about that more supply. If you quickly go back and look at the exact question, what it was saying. Explain what is meant by the extra money was depressing the value of the US dollar on the exchange markets. Extra money was depressing the value of the US dollar on the exchange markets, right? Now, what would that do? Have a look at this. What would that do? Now, when America's supply of dollars is increasing because of any reason, because Americans are importing more, or let's say Americans are going abroad, or Americans are investing abroad, the supply of dollars will increase on international markets. When that happens, the new equilibrium, as you can see, this is the new supply curve, this is the original demand curve, and the new exchange rate, would be lower than, lower than what it was previously, right? So now instead of, let's say, buying £1, each dollar would be buying half a pound, right? Does this make sense? Does it make sense? Right? So this is what happens when supply increases. So more supply of your currency is just like saying when more Pakistanis take Cambridge exams, what will that do? The supply of rupees will increase. Why? Because even though you're paying in rupees upfront, but at some stage, those rupees get converted into what? Those rupees get converted into pounds. So basically, the supply of rupees is increasing, right? And that results in higher weaker exchange rate of rupees against pounds, right? So this is what you need to. Is this simple, Isha, or do you want me to give you another example? Is it making sense? If you watch 1 or 2 videos on the YouTube channel about exchange rate, that will further help you clarify this concept, right? Okay, so this is exactly what you need to explain. This is exactly what you have to explain in this question. You will say, right. For this, I cannot, for the exchange rate, it's already uploaded. So for tonight, you can watch those. And for this video, it will be, inshallah, hopefully available by tomorrow morning.
right? Because there's someone else who uploads it, and obviously there's a little time taken. Okay, great, perfect. Now you were just supposed to explain, draw the graph, tell that whenever the supply of the currency is increasing, apart from the graph that we have drawn, you were just supposed to explain that when the supply of a currency increases, its supply curve shifts to the right and its exchange rate decreases, right? Okay, explain the difference between quantitative easing and supply side policies. This should be simple. So for the supply side, quantitative easing, we have already discussed what is quantitative easing. You will explain in detail because this is for 4 marks. So you will explain in detail that quantitative easing is part of monetary policy, quantitative, right? So you will say quantitative easing is part of monetary policy through which government affects the interest rates in the economy. How does it do that? So for quantitative easing, the central bank, the central bank buys back its bonds, right? Government, or because obviously everything is happening through the central bank. So let's write central bank. Central bank buys back government bonds and pay back the households their money, right? This is how you explain it. Central bank buys back government bonds and pays back household their money, which become, right? Where is this money becoming? So this money that is paid back to households becomes available to the commercial banks then. This is the entire process, right? Central bank buys back government bonds and pay back households their money, which becomes available in commercial banks for issuing of loans, which becomes, right, available to commercial banks to issue loans, and therefore interest rate decreases, right? Because we know whenever there are more loans and there's more supply of loans, interest rates always decrease, and therefore interest rates. Is there any confusion about this? Which results in higher economic activity, so this is the entire explanation that you have to give. You can also make the graph for aggregate demand shifting to the right, because when interest rates drop, I did show you that, let me show you again, right, that your aggregate demand will shift to the right and there will be more real GDP and higher inflation, which increases real GDP and inflation in the country. Is this clear? Real GDP and inflation in the country. And then you will explain what supply side policy is. Supply side policy is not targeting aggregate demand, right? It's not targeting aggregate demand. It's not looking at or controlling how much people will spend. Instead, it's looking at how much is being produced. And what do you do? So for the graph that I was telling you, this is the graph that you have to make, this one, right? So when there will be lower interest rate, I did tell you that it will result in higher consumption, higher investment, and because of that, aggregate demand increase, and therefore that will result in higher real GDP and higher inflation. And for the supply side policies, you'll explain what are supply side policies. So supply side policies are any government initiatives through which government want to promote increased production in the country. Supply side policies are any government initiatives through which government tries to increase production, right? And what do you do in that? So government can give grants to new businesses, government can give tax holidays, right? Not charge taxes to the people, not charge taxes to the businesses in the first few years of their operations, give subsidies, right? Invest in human capital like education, healthcare, so that there are more productive people in the economy, and so on. So this is all what you are supposed to explain in this. Is this making sense? Right? For 4 marks, right? And so the difference is, after explaining both the things, you will say that supply side policies are targeting aggregate supply. in that aggregate supply will shift to the right. And what happens when aggregate supply shifts to the right? When aggregate supply shifts to the right, think about this. Now, if I remove this thing, right? And if I show you what happens when aggregate supply. So when aggregate supply is shifting to the right, your real GDP will increase and your inflation will also decrease. That's the good thing about it, right? So why is that a good thing? Supply side policies are better than demand side policies because, have a look at this. When aggregate supply is shifting to the right, you can see it for yourself that the new equilibrium will be where the new aggregate supply is intersecting with your aggregate demand. So in this case, what will happen? Your journal price level will decrease, and your real GDP will also increase. Your real GDP will also increase, it will shift to the right. Is making sense? So you are getting two benefits in supply side policies. Higher real GDP and at the same time lower inflation. So this is the difference. Supply side policies focus on aggregate supply, and in supply side policies, the real GDP is increasing and inflation is also decreasing, whereas in demand side policies, which are monetary policy and fiscal policy, your real GDP does increase, but at the expense of higher inflation. Your real GDP does increase, but at the expense of higher inflation. Is it making sense? Is everything clear? Any confusion? Right? What's the next question? Analyze whether Nigeria is likely to be a good prospect for investors, right? So I think this is getting late. I have AS class. I don't know why I didn't show the timer today, right? But we'll continue from here. We'll do these two questions tomorrow. Analyze whether Nigeria is likely to be a good prospect for investors. And then the last question will be discuss whether the information that companies have a different opinion to the finance minister about the value of monetary policy. Discuss the evidence in the information that companies have a different opinion to the finance minister about the value of monetary policy. And we'll talk about this as well tomorrow, right? And then we'll continue from here. So tonight, just go and watch the videos for exchange rate, and then tomorrow, we'll continue from here, and then we'll do the essay questions of this paper, right? Okay, so I'll see you tomorrow. Take care and have a good night. Allah Hafiz.